이 불변의 신념을 안고 억세게 나아가는 김정은 빨치산대오의 앞길을 가로막을 자 이 세상에 없습니다. 김정은 동지.
Chased by the deep state, fighting for independence, thinking about revolution, looking for alternative solutions. The enemies of the deep state will tell you what others even don't dare to think. Manuel Ochsenreiter and Mateusz Piskorski.
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the next edition of the North Korea of geopolitical podcasts, of the podcast DieGutenMenschen, Public Enemies of the Deep State. My name is Manuel Ochsenreiter. I am editor-in-chief of the German news magazine Zuerst. And like every week, I speak to Mateusz Piskorski from Poland. Hello, Mateusz.
Hello to you and hello to all the listeners.
So, how is it? Today we will speak almost about the resurrection, right?
Well, it was simply called a resurrection by some media when the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, disappeared for several weeks, over a month, I believe, and then he appeared again. So he was already announced by the leading American media like CNN to be dead, yes, which was quite funny because it was another example. I mean, also his father did similar things or similar, I don't know, maybe miracles, yes. How we could define this, yes. But anyway, this is North Korea is a separate word, we can say. Globally, you cannot compare to any other state, I guess. Some compare it to, for instance, Bhutan, but Bhutan is being also quite close. Is not so important from the point of view of geopolitics. Yes, that's why so many people discuss North Korea and what is going on there. There are several myths about North Korea. On the other hand, we don't have information, and as we don't have official information and official, let's say, correspondence of different media, we get, of course, all those speculative information about different sensational things and processes within the country. That's why I think we should today talk and discuss a topic of isolation, which means, of course, we are all sitting now in isolation as individuals.
In our bunkers, yes.
But let's ask us and our listeners as well, is an isolation of a state possible in terms of, let's say, in terms of its rejection of globalization, of technology, of all the surrounding, yes? Because I think that this topic is quite up to date now, as perhaps we are closing to a moment when some countries, at least some countries or some entities, let's say, will decide to be, let's say, to spend some time in self-isolation. So basically, do you think that someone could announce isolation and execute isolation in the vein of North Korea nowadays?
Well, I think that there are, of course, between being totally open and being totally closed, there are many gray tones between, many levels of gray between this, and there are different degrees of self-isolation. And what is interesting that we discuss today, not just you and me here in the podcast, but even if we read now mainstream media, that the topic of how much can a state or how much should a society isolate itself, or how much should a society be more a closed society and not an open society, that this topic, which was totally demonized just some months ago, is now ready to be discussed, and that is already very interesting. From all models of isolated societies, maybe North Korea is one of the most extreme models, but it is still not a total self-isolation. I have now also, I think some podcasts ago, you told us about your secret hobby, what was listening and reading and watching speeches of US senators and US parliamentarians. And I have also a secret hobby, that is watching documentaries of tourists who went to North Korea, also like private documentaries. So there is, for example, a kind of tourism. It is very strict organized. It is not so easy, and as far as I understood, it is expensive. But it's a very interesting insight, because the tourists going there are not political scientists or ideologues who are seeing everything through the ideological or the political prism. Yeah, they are just going there and they are saying what they see when they speak, for example, to their guide, what they are discussing. And so what is so interesting about North Korea, it is not just a political isolated entity, but it developed within the societies things like their own culture. And if we compare this, for example, with, it is not that they are simply static. So if you compare this with North Korean, for example, propaganda from the 1950s after the Korean War, or from the 1960s, there is also a development, but it is their own development, and like an independent cultural development when it comes to music, when it comes to theater, when it comes to songs. And that is really quite interesting. The Western view on these things is often very arrogant. You know, they are watching down on such developments. But this is why I prefer, and that is why it's the hobby, to watch through the prism of the not so political tourist who goes there because it is not easy to get there, because he wants to. Why is a Western tourist going to North Korea? To come back and to brag about that he have been in a country where all the others in his living room, when he shows the pictures, haven't been and actually don't know how to get there. So we can observe with North Korea such, maybe you mentioned Bhutan. There, I have to admit, I don't know so much how there this development is, but with North Korea we can see an absolute unique example how a society develops under the circumstances of self-isolation. And that is very interesting and is not that negative as, of course, Western propagandists say it is.
Of course, and actually, well, on the one hand, to be honest, I don't see a big difference between, for instance, closed North Korea, where foreign correspondents and reporters usually don't have any access, and for instance, I don't know, Iran or Venezuela, where foreign correspondents and journalists can enter. But anyway, we have the same level of fantasy and manipulation about those countries, I guess. Yes, you know, it's a little difference. If I mean the media, the mainstream media work in such a way now that it really doesn't make any difference. I mean, if other countries would close their borders for the correspondence of let's say CNN or other US and Western European mainstream media, they would have the same result as they have now, yes, because the level of manipulation is huge anyway. So when it comes to North Korea, I totally agree that we actually don't know how the system works, how it looks. We have just a few scholars, political scientists who are specializing in the Far East and who have published several books on that. But for me, the best proof if a given author, a given scholar, a given political scientist is more or less unbiased and independent is the question if he, after publishing his book can enter North Korea once more.
Yeah.
Because I personally, for instance, I personally knew a well-known professor who worked with, he has written a lot about the Far East, North Korea, and let's say that back in the 90s he could travel there. He traveled there a lot, and he wrote quite good books. Unfortunately for him, one of his last books, actually his last book on North Korea, was somehow supported and I guess also influenced by one of the American foundations. Yes, that's why the book had to be critical towards Phenian and North Korean authorities. After that, he was no more admitted to enter North Korea, as the North Koreans are following all the publications. And I think anyway, his previous books were not a kind of pro-North Korean propaganda, yes, but they were just scientific, political scientist books, an expert and so on, without any bias. So those scholars, and we still have several European high-level scholars and professors who can travel there, are worthy to be read. About the ideology of the state, about, let's say, some kind of an anthropology as well, because I would even say that they have managed to, let's say, create a new type of society and a new type of individual as well. I think that it's quite deeply rooted. And by the way, for those primitive anti-communists who claim that it's a communist regime, it's worthy to remind that the whole system is very, very deeply rooted in the local culture. I mean, it's not only the Marxism or Maoism imported from other countries, but it's also deeply rooted in local, even the spiritual traditions when it comes to their way to perceive the leader as a representative of God and so on. Yes, so it's quite interesting to study, I guess. Of course, it is an extreme example, yes, as you have mentioned in the beginning of our discussion, and I totally agree with you that we should not. I mean, it's not our task to criticize or to praise North Korea here. Yes, just we are talking about an example, one of the very, very few examples in the world of an isolated country, in the context of the possibility and the potential of isolation of other countries. And here I totally agree with you and with your point of view that perhaps to some extent, and an isolation would be possible. But I also totally agree with you that the most important point of the Korean case is that they are isolated from the influence of Western mass culture. And as you have mentioned, they have created their own culture, yes. And for us, for instance, let's imagine, for instance, Germany. Yes, Germany takes a decision to isolate itself from the outside world. Anyway, still the influence of, let's say, Hollywood culture would be there for many, many years, or many, many decades, I guess. Yes.
Yeah, for generations, of course, and since we were letting it in, I mean, I think the North Korean example is showing some lessons or teaching some lessons now, also without seeing this positive or negative, but just as fact. So first of all, North Korea managed to keep out the Hollywood culture from the beginning. Yeah, I think that is an important element when it comes to culture. So Hollywood didn't even enter, because I think if you have Hollywood in the country, it's very hard to get it out again. So they had from the beginning their own movie industry, of course, totally different to the Hollywood movie industry. But I wanted to come from the culture to another example, North Korea's teaching, and you also mentioned, for example, Iran, in the context of of isolated societies or isolated countries, and we both agree that Iran has a degree of isolation which is much, much less than the North Korean one, since we have also to say that Iran is isolated not just by their own will, but by the policy of the West. So the West is trying hard to isolate Iran, while North Korea, it is also a self-chosen way. But what I wanted to say, and what is an interesting question, is does North Korea teach us the lesson that a state, an entity, which goes for the way of self-isolation must at the same time be willing to defend this self-isolation if necessary to the very, very last end. Because when it comes to North Korea, that is what arrives in the West when it comes to the news and when it comes to the statements. That is that North Korea is willing to defend itself really to the ground, that they say nothing is acceptable for us which shall dictate us how to reform or how to change the rules of our society by the will of a foreign entity. And I think that is very interesting. And of course, do you think we would speak today about North Korea if North Korea wouldn't be a nuclear armed country? That is also an interesting question.
Of course not.
What do you mean?
As we don't speak about Bhutan.
Yeah.
This is a good example. Yes, of course. Perhaps it's not only about the nuclear weapon and so on, but it's also about its geopolitical place in the whole architecture of the Far East. Yes, and what we are, for instance, looking at now, and we have discussed the topic before with you, is of course the confrontation between the US and China. Yes.
Yeah.
And here, from this purely geopolitical point of view, first we have to admit that North Korea is probably, as we don't have official data, but it's probably to a large extent dependent on China when it comes to technologies and to imports of several goods. And second, we have to also notice, that's by the way quite interesting, that in December last year, in 2019, the US has withdrawn from several WTO structures. I mean, the Appellation Court of Appellation of World Trade Organization, for instance, yes. And now they are creating their, let's say, a kind of their own alliance when it comes to arbitrary courts and to international trade disputes. When it comes to the Far East, we have now two blocks. On the one hand, we have, of course, China, which is still, which has even initiated a new, let's say, new mechanism, a new procedure of international arbitrary court in international trade. And you have the bloc headed by the US, together with Japan, with South Korea, and of course with unrecognized Taiwan as a part of China. And this bloc is headed by United States. So I think that the geopolitical controversies and conflicts, the conflict potential of the region now concerning the confrontation between Washington and Beijing will be higher and higher. That's why any information or misinformation about what is going on in North Korea, what is going on with its leader and so on, is being used and abused by both sides of the geopolitical confrontation there, yes. On the other hand, some specialists working on North Korea have also managed to see that there are some similarities between the behavior of and the case of the current Korean leader and his father, the previous leader, yes. And the similarity is that North Korean leaders sometimes had a tendency first to disappear and then to disseminate false information about their death or about their state of health. Yes. Why? Just for internal reasons. Because in such a case, a leader in an authoritarian regime, in any kind of regime, even in democracy as well, can observe as how the rest, how his followers behave, yes, and what is the level of loyalty of his close cooperatives there, yes. We cannot exclude that it was also a kind of, let's say, internal experiment, political experiment by the North Korean authorities as well, yes. Anyway, the context is quite complex, and the lesson for us, I guess, is not to listen to CNN or Fox News or other mainstream, not only when it comes to North Korea, but when it comes to all other countries, because their information are not information, but just speculations. Yeah?
A great president in the West called CNN fake news, and you know who I mean. And if we would have listened to this president, he always told us his friend Kim is okay, he is fine. He knows he's fine.
Yes.
So we can, but that was quite funny. That was quite funny that whoever listened to CNN was really trapped by fake news, and that who listened in this case to Donald Trump really knew that Trump was telling the truth. We cannot say it in a different way.
Yes, because to say the least, I guess that anyway. Regardless the internal divisions in United States, Donald Trump still has some access to the reports of different intelligence services working all around the world. Yes.
Yes, and
I knew that his friend Kim was okay and right. Yes.
yes. That was very great when he said that. No worries, my friend is okay. That's yes. And of course we shouldn't listen to the South Korean intel reports when it comes to these things, and to the South Korean media. Of course, they have also an interest. They have an interest to provoke turmoil and public disorder in the north, because I remember that a lot of Western news agencies were quoting the South Korean intelligence agencies and the South Korean media, who were all saying, yes, Kim died and he's now away, and there will be a big fight among who will proceed in the position of the great leader and so on. So I think these are also lessons to be learned, but I have a feeling that our mainstream media and our mainstream politicians didn't really learn that lesson.
Of course. By the way, it was quite funny because I haven't read that because it's a waste of time, but anyway, we could see even in the internet a lot of let's say so-called all self-proclaimed expert publications, like, a lengthy analysis of who will be the next leader of North Korea and so on, yes? So people, let's say, basing on the false information from the mainstream media, they even waste their time to write and publish huge lengthy materials and to pretend that they are so expert on a topic. And then Kim resurrects, and their expertise is worth nothing. Yes.
Maybe some listeners ask themselves why we are so soft, and maybe even when they listen that it sounds a little bit friendly with North Korea. And I want to tell a little anecdote. You remember maybe also, even if we were not doing something together back then, do you remember in the 1990s on May 18th, and just for the listeners, Mateusz and me, we have birthday at the same day, at the May 18th. So, do you remember there was on May 18th, somewhere in the 90s, a huge nuclear test in North Korea where all our media was reporting about? I came back in the early morning from my birthday party from the 17th to the 18th. I switched on the TV news and I saw the rocket rising from North Korea. And I said, thank you. Do you remember? I don't know which year it was. Must have been something like 95, 96, something like that. But I remember this very well, and it gives me a warm feeling.
Mm-hmm. It happens permanently, so let's hope, as you have already informed our listeners, when is our birthday?
Yes, May 18th. If there is listening any president or head of state do a nuclear test, we will be both happy and thankful.
Yes.
and dedicate a show to you.
This is a message for our North Korean friends as well. Yes.
Yes. If you have one rocket too much, test it next week.
Yes.
Okay. So. Now I think it's time that we go back in our own self-isolation into our bunkers.
Exactly, but we'll be back soon in a few days again, and we are really appreciating all the comments and opinions of our listeners, and we enhance them also to write about the topics they would like us to discuss. So give us our homework as we are in isolation.
This program was presented to you by Manuel Ochsenreiter and Mateusz Piskorski, the hottest dissident who won't violate any time the global rules against racism, extremism, or any other bad isms.